On the night of the 9th of December 1886, violent storms swept across the Lancashire coast. Gale-force winds, mountainous seas and snow squalls drove the ship, the Mexico, onto the dangerous sandbanks of the Ribble Estuary near Southport and Lytham. Distress signals were seen from the shore, and immediately lifeboat crews answered the call. However, what followed was the biggest lifeboat disaster in British UK history. On a freezing December night, in hurricane-force winds and blinding snow, ordinary men launched fragile lifeboats into the fury of the Irish Sea to save strangers in peril. Many never returned. The disaster unfolded on the night of the 9th of December 1886. The German ship Mexico, a 400-ton sailing vessel, left Liverpool, bound for Guayaquil in Ecuador. But that night violent storms swept across the Lancashire coast and drove the ship onto the sandbanks of the Ribble Estuary. Distress signals were seen from the shore, and immediately lifeboat crews from Southport, St Anne's and Lytham answered the call. A lifeboat from Southport, the Eliza Fernley, her 16-man crew battled enormous waves towards the wreck. But as they neared the Mexico, the sea overwhelmed them. The lifeboat capsized in the storm. Only 2 men survived, Henry Robinson and John Jackson, who clung desperately to the overturned hull before swimming ashore. 14 of their crewmates drowned. The St Anne's lifeboat, Laura Janet, launched into the same deadly seas. Unlike the Southport crew, none of the 13 men aboard survived, and the boat never even reached the wreck. It was found washed ashore the following morning, smashed by the storm. All 13 men on board that boat lost their lives. Perhaps most tragically of all was the fact that the boat from Lytham, the Charles Biggs, had launched first, on its very first rescue mission. The crew battled impossible conditions, oar snaps, waves flooded the boat repeatedly, but somehow they reached the stricken Mexico. By then the sailors aboard the ship had tied themselves to the rigging to avoid being washed away, and against all odds the Charles Biggs rescued every one of the 12 crew members aboard the Mexico. That was before the other 2 lifeboats had even launched. By dawn, 27 lifeboatmen were dead, and it remains the worst single disaster in RNLI history. News of the tragedy shocked Victorian Britain, and newspapers across the country carried stories of the disaster. The courage of the lifeboat crews captured the public imagination, but the scale of the loss horrified the nation. The human cost was enormous. The 27 men who died left behind 16 widows and 50 children. Fishing and lifeboat communities were devastated. Public appeals raised money for the grieving families, and donations came from across Britain and from royalty, including Queen Victoria and Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. But the disaster also changed the future of sea rescue. The tragedy highlighted weaknesses in lifeboat design and safety procedures, helping drive improvements in RNLI lifeboats in the years that followed. Today, nearly a century and a half later, the memory of the Mexico disaster still lives on across the Fylde coast. Several memorials were erected to honour the men who died. The men on the Eliza Fernley, the Laura Janet and the Charles Biggs were not soldiers. They were fishermen, labourers, sailors and fathers. Yet on that winter night in 1886, they displayed extraordinary courage in service of others. The Mexico disaster reminds us that heroism is often found not in glory, but in duty. And though the sea claimed many lives that night, it will never wash away their legacy.